looking at the chat. Some of you joining us I've known for just a little while, and some of you I've known for many years. I'm mindful of the variety of blessings and the variety of feelings which you bring to this moment, and I'm grateful to be with you. Let's get into this important conversation. So first, I want to turn the first question over. Really, I want to open it up to the full panel, but Ms. Schellee, Rocher, I want to start with you because we've, sort of set the tone here today talking about family, friend, and neighbor care. But before we get into the meat and potatoes, if you will, of the history, the present day, and the future state, can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences with family, friend, and neighbor care as being a recipient of family, friend, and neighbor care yourself?
I can, thank you. And hello to everyone. Greetings from Los Angeles. During our planning, which is why I think Dr. Johnson is asking me to speak about this, I shared that my sister and I were recipients of family, friend, and neighbor care as children right here in our community of Leimert Park. For those of you who know Los Angeles, our caregiver's name was Miss Margie. I spoke to my mother and got a little more information about how she came to decide to put us in family care with her. And I asked about, was she licensed? And my mom said, back then, this is the 1960s. And she said, no, as far as I know, no, but that wasn't something that she was seeking out. She said it was for convenience. This was a woman who had a reputation in the community as a caregiver that people wanted to take their children to. And she paid $10 a week for each child to go there. And also there was a type of bartering system, which I'll go into later as we get through the questions. But I thought that was something interesting too, that oftentimes if people didn't have a lot to pay, they bartered for services. My mother is a cosmetologist. And so sometimes even she would do Miss Margie's hair. If she needed to go somewhere to an affair and needed her hair done. So that sort of thing happened in the Black community. And Miss Margie served many children, cared for many children over time that my mom knew. Also because people felt she would take children in at 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks as infants. My mother said she had to get back to work. That's often a factor as well. And we stayed with her until we went to kindergarten.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Schellee. And I can imagine that among our other two panelists, that there are other experiences that they were with providers that loved them into being. So Dr. Govan-Hunt, would you care to share your experiences as well?
Absolutely. Thank you. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Certainly excited about this conversation. So I think about my personal experiences with family, friends, and neighbor care. I grew up in a military family. I was raised by two parents who were raised in Jim Crow South in South Carolina. So they knew the importance of placing us, my siblings and I, in environments that would affirm us, would uplift us, would teach us things that curricula sometimes doesn't teach. So our experiences, wherever we went, doesn't matter where we traveled, my mother was the one that created a village for us, whether we had family in the same country, the same state, the same city, wherever my father was stationed. Of course, at the time, we didn't know it was called family, friends, and neighbor care, right? We just knew there was a trusting person in the building or on the block or in the community that knew all of the children, that knew what our strengths were, that our parents were comfortable with, familiar with, and that they knew we would get what we needed from that person, whether it would be just affirmations, whether it be, a math lesson that day on how to bake cookies or some recipe, a life lesson on how you treat individuals and how you value the people that are in your surroundings, in your community, how to communicate, that we would get those things. And there would be lessons that we could take into the school system when we did get there. So that's our experience. We had a host of caregivers around the world, around the country, that would fall into this category. So that's my experience with that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Kamren, any thoughts to add?
Yes, I do. First, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm excited about this conversation. And I think one of the reasons why I was so excited about it was because I think during the planning, I realized how my life was impacted by family, a friend, and neighbor care. And so I actually went to two providers, early on in my life. The first was Miss Vanessa and Aunt Irma. We had no true familial connection, but it felt like it. We were there. My brother and I. We were there. My mother, as a young mother, she sent us there. She got connected with Miss Vanessa, and we were there for many years. And Miss Vanessa had many children that that she hosted and cared for, and it was a truly transformative, I think, experience. And the second was Mama, is what we called her. That was my grandmother, and the same experience. I think the significance for us was that it taught us community and the value of it. I remember the walks that we would take, the lessons that we would learn during the walks, the way that we would interact with so many other children that lived around the neighborhood, simply from this being in this core space, right? And how it made space for us as young children, but also I think as a community overall, understanding that this was a space that we were cared for, that children were cared for. And I'm definitely grateful for that experience.
Thank you so much for sharing. And, I can echo, with these themes of trust and family and commitment and dedication and exploration and creativity and love and nurturing with my own experiences, because I see and I hear about Miss Margie, and I see in the comments, Miss Margie did not play. And I think that we all can say that the people who loved us into being truly took pride in not just the calling to be in our lives, but also the responsibility to shape us into the leaders that we would soon become. And so I'm grateful for all of you sharing a little bit about your journey and a little bit about your story. And I can echo, if it had not been for my aunts and my grandmothers and my cousins and my big cousins and all of those that were part of that village, I don't think that I would be who I am had it not been for their love and care. And so I thank you for your vulnerability, and again, for you sharing. Against that backdrop, we framed this conversation as one that will sort of take the listeners and those of you in the audience that are joining us near and far to understand, what family, friend, and neighbor care has sort of taken shape from a historical perspective, from a present day perspective, and then hear from our state leaders, sort of what are their thoughts about the future and sort of their visions for the future and hopes for the future. So what we want to start with is sort of this historical perspective first. And so I know we launched this conversation with talking about our own personal stories, or the state leaders talking about their own personal stories. But we all recognize, based on the bios that I read, that these are early childhood leaders who have been committed to this field for a very long time, with lots of experience in working with families, and they'll be speaking to these experiences based on the questions that I posed. And so I want to also just acknowledge that this first question, again, is rooted in this historical perspective, but also just curious about this history to date. So you, Ms. Schellee, have been for many, many years been a part of the early childhood community in Los Angeles County. And you helped me understand that Los Angeles County is huge. And I recognize that the work that it takes to deliver on the promise of support to those families is quite a feat to be acknowledged. And so I know that FFN care has evolved through the years, and was wondering if you could speak to sort of what you observed through that evolution in your work since being in the roles that you've led to date.
All right, well, I want to start with, throughout my research too, I found this quote in a report that I'll share the link to that I think is very powerful. I'll share it in the chat as we move forward, but around the perspective, historical perspective, this quote, it says, as the demographics of our country shift, so as the faces of the caretakers of America's children. To date, Black women continue to be represented in high numbers in the domestic service, caretaking, and child care spheres. And it says their numbers have remained fairly consistent since emancipation. Research gives us no doubt that the poor wages the child care professionals of every race receive is a direct result of the devaluing of child care that is rooted in the history of slavery and the country's perceptions of Black women. And so as you asked for that, when I was doing the research, I thought that was an important quote and powerful and meaningful as we start this conversation. And so looking at the first kind of bullet was what work have you seen around FFNs in your state to date? In our state, our Governor Newsom's administration in 2021 developed what they call the Master Plan for Early Learning and Care, Making California for All Children. It's a strategic vision and roadmap for the next 10 years. And it was released by California Health and Human Services Department. So here in California, FFN care is referred to as license exempt. And provider types and licensing status determines the number of children that they can care for and the regulations that they have to follow, eligibility for funding, and types of support and resources that they receive. Right, throughout our state, there are organizations that have also developed special programs to support specifically license exempt care providers. Parents can choose, we have parent choice, so parents can choose what type of care they want their children in. I want to give examples of the kind of support that FFNs receive. So for instance, CPR training. There are play dates that are in parks or at YMCAs that family, friend, and neighbor caregivers can take children to, and they're especially helpful to parents. So advocates continue to there's reimbursement rates. FFN providers are usually paid by parents directly, but also they can get subsidies through our CalWorks system, and or our alternative payment program, but there's not enough money to go around for everyone that needs it. So there's also opportunities for them to get grants for facilities, which is something new. But there still is a big disparity between what FFN care providers receive if they're not licensed.
Thank you so much for sharing that information and really, making it plain about the challenges that can occur when it comes to delivering on the promise of FFN care. And also just speaking to sort of the determinations of eligibility and how those determinations land with how funding is received and whatnot. And so Dr. Govan-Hunt, I know that things are very different in North Carolina than they are in California. And I'm curious if you could also speak to what you've seen around FFN care in your state to date as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So FFN care has been a very touchy subject from where we sit here in the state of North Carolina. Particularly because whenever we speak about family, friends, and neighbor care, the conversation has a tendency, which is why I appreciate your level setting, your grounding at the top of this conversation, has a tendency to actually revert to who's licensed, to who's not licensed, and then there's this myth of meritocracy in this space. If you have a particular degree, then you're allowed to deliver a certain kind of care. We as in the state of North Carolina, just recently gotten to the point from our perspective here to where we are comfortable having conversations about family, friends, and neighbor care, and understanding that even though we have a very robust licensing system here in North Carolina that includes a star-rated license system, that also includes Ms. Shelley mentioned license exempt, we would refer to those license exempt programs here as religious-based programs or GS 110 programs. So even then, in those two buckets that I just identified, family child care homes, FFN still sits on the outskirts of the conversations. But now we're in a space where we're recognizing, after having these conversations, direct conversations with families, actually pushing into communities through the work that happens, such as that in Candle Care and learning work, where we have these listening tours that we're hearing directly from families, people who are raising children, young children in the state of North Carolina, across the state. And we're understanding that it's happening and that we should not slap people on the wrist, because we are saying that there are children that are receiving this type of care. There are families across our state that appreciate this type of care, that prefer this type of care for various reasons, especially those reasons that center around culture and language and creating or placing children in affirming environments, so that we can begin to figure out how we loop family, friends, and neighbor care into a larger ecosystem. Whether we're talking directly about funding or just creating this holistic approach that centers family choice and in the center of these conversations. So it's been very interesting over the past 10 plus years or so to see how the comfort level and the acknowledgement, even the simple acknowledgement that all of our children are not in licensed care, that all of our children are not in family child care homes, that there are children who are, with grandmothers and aunties, and older sisters, or Miss Margaret. I think somebody mentioned Miss Margaret in the chat, or Miss Betty, that, in the neighborhood that everybody trusts, and who has, genius skills when it comes to helping to raise whole, healthy Black children. So that's where we are in North Carolina right now.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for bringing us up to speed. We also want to have an opportunity for Kamren to respond. I know that while you are new to your role as the BCDI DC president, you're not new to early childhood broadly in the leadership space. So want to also offer you an opportunity to speak to the same question of what you've seen to date around FFN and in your leadership purview.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. So I would say FFN is pretty similar in DC. So we have licensed and we have license exempt providers. We also have providers that don't necessarily fall within either of the categories, who aren't licensed and don't necessarily fall or meet the criteria to be licensed exempt. I think it's definitely necessary to have more conversations around how we can still support all providers, all individuals that service children. For to be a licensed facility, there are some criteria. You have to either have caregivers have to have a CDA, a child development associate, or they have to have an associate's degree, depending on the quantity of children they're able to serve. I think the conversation is definitely moving forward, but I think, we definitely just need to be, or we have to be more intentional about offering supports, for instance, to individuals that are not licensed. Currently, there are quite a bit of offerings that are made to licensed childcare for FFN providers, from scholarship programs to pay equity, but that definitely does not correspond to individuals that don't fall in that category. So we definitely feel there are definitely some clear discrepancies or some areas of lack that we know impact the quality of education, but also quality of services that providers are able to have.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you. And Dr. Govan-Hunt, you have a comment?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Kareem. I just wanted to point out also that I think we have a tendency, we blame a lot of things on the pandemic, right? We blame a lot of things on the pandemic. We we use it as a crutch for for not addressing things that have always existed. But what I will say in terms of COVID is that it did create space in this state anyway for us to have more intentional conversations about family, friends, and neighbor care. During that time when COVID school closures and childcare centers had no other option but to close their doors, and there was nothing but family childcare homes really kind of standing on the forefront and allowing families, our families, to be able to go to work. Our children had to take advantage of family members. They had to receive that kind of care. And so this provided space for us to say, these children received family, friends, and neighbor care. They were safe. When it was time to go back into the school buildings or the childcare centers or wherever they sent them, not only were they whole and healthy, they were prepared to cross that threshold in lots of different ways. So they received skills that they probably would not have even received otherwise had it not had the opportunity to experience that particular type of care. So conversations around how do we fund those opportunities? How do we support those Black women who are delivering this type of care now gets pushed to the top of the agenda. And we're not afraid to say, okay, this is a real thing. This can be a part of a more holistic approach. Let's talk about it.
Love it. Love it, love it, love it. No, I really appreciate you adding that. And I'm threading together all of what you all are sharing. Schellee?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add really quickly, we got to move forward, but to that point about FFN care and the pandemic, because something else that happened also with licensed exempt care, and people don't often think about that care can happen in the parent's home as well. It doesn't always happen with the parent having to take the child somewhere. Sometimes the caregiver comes to their home, and through the pandemic and the research, it said that was happening here more. And when people were working from home, someone could come into their home, often a family member, to care for the child in the home. Because some, of course, didn't feel comfortable sending their children into a program, even if it wasn't FFN in someone else's home. But there were often times when folks would come, or family members, to the child's home and care for them so that the parent could work from home. And then also if the child was nursing, they said that was an advantage because they could, nurse the child was at home. And if there were older children that were school age going somewhere else, then that caregiver could go and transport those children so that the parent could be working from home. So that was another something that was a positive that happened during COVID that involved FFN care.
Yeah, no, that I think that is certainly incredible to point out and important to point out. And to your point, Dr. Govan-Hunt, that we have noticed for many, many years sort of the strain on the workforce, and anyone can sort of point to health, early childhood, maternal health, infant health, all of these different systems of support that support the health and overall well-being of our families being stretched, and then COVID revealing just how stretched they were, but us acknowledging that they were already stretched before the pandemic. And also to your point about really getting clear about, now that we see these gaps and now that we see these issues coming to light, there is now no excuse for us to really prioritize the areas that are hemorrhaging much quicker than the other areas. And so I just appreciate you adding that, and also pointing out, Schellee and Kamren, how these kinds of expressions of care can look like, and not like what we often think of when we think center-based care. Like imagining, as a former early childhood educator, there are policies in place about me giving a ride to a parent, or, trying to take a child somewhere. There are policies in place for a reason. And we also acknowledge that in situations and circumstances that look and feel and are family, friend, and neighbor care environments, that there are issues that come up for parents that providers immediately address, like being able to pick up and stand in the gap while families are working from home. So I really appreciate you naming that and again acknowledging that. And one question that comes up when we talk about this kind of care, sort of as we shift to sort of present day, since we really laid down the sort of historical foundation of this conversation, is, you know, what are some of the factors, you know, that would contribute to a family choosing FFN care over something that, as we know, and as we've stated, is more structured, more well-funded. So I would love for us to really share with the audience some of the factors that you've come across in your work, why someone would be willing to say, I actually am preferring FFN care over what I know is down the street, which is license-based, license eligible. And I know they're going to get the meals and everything orderly and on time. But this is something that I believe in and that I want to be a part of as it respects my culture. So I want to open it up to whether you, Dr. Govan-Hunt, want to go first, or you, Schellee, because I know Dr. Govan-Hunt, we had a conversation about some of the things you were noticing in terms of themes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This has to be one of my favorite questions because we have the opportunity to voice things exactly the way that our families have shared them with us. Dr. Johnson, these folks are trying to grow whole, healthy Black children. What does that mean? That means that they are more concerned about how well their child is being treated. They're concerned about how affirming the environment is. They are concerned on whether or not life skills are being taught through real tangible and realistic and everyday experiences. They want their children happy. They want their children to receive culturally relevant meals during the day. They want to be able to have their children in spaces where their values and their beliefs are aligned with the caregiver. Just because a program has a license does not mean that that is happening. Our quality rating systems are oftentimes flawed in the way that they actually decide to rate quality, because the way quality is rated has nothing to do with what families have requested or identified as quality for their needs. They want to be able to know that they have flexibility, that they have relationships, deep relationships with caregivers, because if we can make sure that our children enter a space, a formal academic space after they leave the early education setting, emotionally sound, socially sound, we can teach them anything. But if we put them in a center, and if the only thing that we're looking at is whether or not a program is licensed or not, right? And licensed in terms of all the boxes that a state has outlined, not the families that live in that state, and even more so, not the Black families that live in that state, right? That's not as high on the list for folks. We want our children okay. We want peace of mind when we go off to go to work. We want to know that our babies are going to be okay and that those values align with our personal values. That's just a little bit.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for making it plain.
Yes.
To the people in the back and the front. Schellee, I'll turn it to you as well to share your thoughts also.
I'm like, wow, I don't know. Listen, she laid it out. I will amen to everything and second everything that she said. I think that's global. That's not just state specific. Everything Dr. Govan-Hunt laid out is, I think, just as Black people, Black parents, Black families. She was right on point. She hit the nail on the head there. What I will add too, and just in kind of the listing, like trust is important, especially with infant toddlers, because a lot of people say, and especially in our communities, I don't want to send my child somewhere outside of family until they can talk and until they can communicate. So often it's infants and toddlers, and until children go off to they're preschool age, a lot of families are real skeptical about sending those children into environments when they're not able to communicate what's happening or something's happened to them. Flexibility of hours is important, especially for people that do shift work, right? A lot of centers and license programs are only open from maybe 6 to 6. But what if you work at night, right? What if you work on a shift that doesn't fall within those hours? That's another reason it's important. And a lot of times that's our families, our people. Food, the type of food that they serve there, is it culturally relevant to the children? We joke about rice and peas. It's like, yeah, you know, for a Black family, and that's their culture and their food, they want their children served that, but perhaps the center will not prepare those kinds of food. Transportation, cost, language, intergenerational bonding, having children be able to spend more time with grandparents, either keeping the money in the household. So if they are able to be paid for caring for the children, but let's say they all live together as a family, they want to keep the money in the household. Smaller number of children, safety, location, shortage of licensed programs, long wait list. And another one was the children get sick too often in a center-based or a larger environment. And especially with COVID and even before COVID, you know, and some folks are sketchy about vaccination. So I think to add to what Dr. Govan-Hunt, all the things that she pointed out, to add, those are just a few more reasons and factors. And that was one of my favorite questions too, right? Around we may choose FFN care over licensed or larger environments for childcare.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing. I'm seeing a lot of themes here around flexibility, about the hours, about sort of keeping the money in the household, about communicating, being a really sticking point for children. I know I definitely grew up with family members, because we all know developmentally around the age of 2, it's very important for children to really be understanding the power of language, because that's when you're describing everything they see and everything that they're part of and everything that they're doing that's developmentally appropriate. And we want to make sure that when they're in those settings, that they don't know the name of the settings that they're in, that they're being cared for, but they do have someone that is in that setting that is providing those culturally relevant meals and spaces that values the values that align with those of the families. And so I really appreciate you naming that. Kamren, definitely want to offer you the opportunity to sort of speak to what you've seen around some of the factors, and maybe some of the factors might be some that are already named, but if there are others that that you want to also lift up or either affirm, I definitely want to give you the opportunity to share that as well.
Be honest, it's difficult to go after those 2 responses. I think it covered, to be honest, I think it covered a large range of what, at least what I've seen in what I've heard in conversations, and also what I've seen. That level of, I'll just echo that level of trust, right? And parents knowing that I can come to this individual and I know my child is safe, and that, you know, that safety, that security, right, and that peace of mind, I think is really important for families, especially in communities that in Black communities. I think it's really important understanding that I don't want my child to be just another number, right? Not only do I want to have a relationship, or do parents want to have a relationship with the provider, they also want the provider to have a relationship with the child. And because when we even think developmentally, that's essential, right? So I think that, and that whole shaping of community is really important, right? I know there's some providers, or there's some FFN providers that not only took care of the parent, but they took care of the child, right? So that level of the continuum of our relationship, but also of like development, I think is really important. And it emphasizes the need for parents to go with FFN providers. And to be honest, a lot of the parents that I talk to, it's not even an option, right? So it's FFN it's it, right? So I think it's necessary that we figure out ways to continue to support them, because for many parents, there's no other option.
Yeah, and I would just echo, when I think about the concept and understanding around secure attachment relationships, we all know that there is no substitute for secure attachment relationships. It is dependent upon those foundational relationships of those nurturing caregivers for those babies who then become toddlers, who then become preschool age children, who then grow up to be these teenagers with gusto, right? And then become these adults walking among us in this wide, wondrous thing human existence is. So I'm very mindful that all of the things that you name, like flexibility, deep relationships, treatment of our children, life skills, what they're being taught, are they happy, relevant meals, spaces, valuing their culture, and sort of acknowledging this. These are global feelings, universal feelings that we all have as families who grow up in the places and spaces where we're learning. And we're learning how to live and move and have our being all within the context of family and community. And so I know we've talked a great deal here about why, families choose FFN care. But now I'm just curious about sort of the flip side of that. When we think about providers and providers who choose to say, I'm going to take up this commitment and be an FFN care provider. And I'm curious of what you all have observed in your work. So sort of looking at it from the vantage point of the provider and why they might stay in that particular role and position as a nurturer for those children. And so I know we've talked about the families and them sort of thinking about, before I drop my kid off, these are the things that this is my checklist, these are my guidelines, this is my framework, however we want to name it or call it, but these are the things that I'm expecting when I drop my child off. And then there's also providers who have an expectation and who are standing in a commitment to this work and want to deliver on that promise. So I'm curious, Schellee, and I can start with you, what you've seen from providers who, they could be in a licensed center-based, they could be license exempt, they could be doing all of these other things, but they're choosing to commit to FFN. Why do you think that is so? And in your work, what have you seen in terms of themes?
Again, we've already covered some of it. It falls in that same space of some have made the choice, mostly here, it's what I think 96% they stay in that space because they're relative care. And they're doing this to help the family. And if the family is large and there are multiple children, someone could stand in that space for many years, right? They're the ones who, when someone in the family has a child, that caregiver is where all the children go for the family until they are school aged. In our state, we have a large immigrant population and not just Latino, we also have a Black immigrant population here, Belizeans, Haitians, and due to immigration status is another reason that some people have not moved forward with licensing out of fear. Sometimes they don't have all the information. But in many cases, they're fine with staying in that space. They're not interested in becoming licensed. And they look at themselves more as a community resource versus a business. But there are some who do want to take that step. And there are programs here that can help them do so. But typically, it usually, from my experience, no matter whether I was working in California or the other states that you mentioned, it is often relative care. And there are people who are committed to the community and see themselves as a community resource, and they want to stand in that space and continue to stand, like Ms. Margie did for us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I definitely want to continue to build on this point. Dr. Govan-Hunt, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that there has been enough data collection around with this conversation, trying to answer this question, because it's been such a taboo. It's been so taboo in this state to even have conversations about family, friends, and neighbor care, because according to the way that childcare is regulated in the state of North Carolina, when it comes to certain numbers of children, it can be considered a federal offense. So if you are in the community and providing that type of care, they're going to be real reluctant to raise their hand and say, hey, let me tell you why I'm doing this, right? But based on some of the information that we've been able to collect from family members that provide family, friends, and neighbor care, they do it because they have a sense of obligation to their community. To Shelly's point, it's almost like a service. I want to be a resource to families. I can give you an example of a woman that we interviewed recently who's from the Low Country. When I say the Low Country, I'm referring to Charleston, South Carolina, down in those areas. So she grew up in communities where they took care of each other. Even her ancestors, straight from off of the plantations down there in Charleston, they took care of each other. If we were a certain group of them that had to go out and go to work, we didn't have access to childcare. We weren't allowed access to those types of services. So we had no other choice but to take care of each other. And we sent those children into the school system, not only prepared, but they were ready to face any challenges and adversity that they were actually going to come up against once they got behind those walls and those buildings. So her story was, this is what I come from. I don't know any other way. I know our families can't afford childcare. Licensed childcare, because it's very costly to pay for childcare in the state of North Carolina, just like any other state, I would imagine. So this was, she would serve as a resource. She was happy doing so. She wasn't worried about compensation because her families took care of her. So it was something that she needed, this bartering system that I think Shelly mentioned it earlier. That's what happens in her community. So those are the types of stories that we've been able to collect, but I do believe that we could put a lot more effort in making it more comfortable and convenient for those folks who are offering that level of care to come forward and share their stories. If we are going to be intentional about creating, a more equitable system for childcare for our families, options for our families.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I, recognize that, there are also thoughts being shared in the chat. And I absolutely welcome those of you to share your thoughts about, if you are a provider, you've worked with providers and have thoughts around many of the reasons why they choose to stay. Absolutely. Please share those in the chat as well as your questions. And Kamren, definitely want to offer you an opportunity to sort of speak to, as you've seen in your work, in your role, why providers choose this kind of care. And again, we'll preface this by saying that perhaps some of the things that you might name also might be shared among what Dr. Govan-Hunt and what Shelly have shared, but also want to acknowledge that if there are other thoughts that you want to add, either you're affirming those or thoughts that weren't addressed yet, to feel free.
Definitely. I've seen like a full range of reasonings that have contributed to FFN providers staying in the space, coming to it, but also staying in the field. One, it's like a commitment to care, impact, and community. I think that's just something that I've seen across the board. But also I have here wanting a level of autonomy. So not wanting to go work for a larger center, but wanting to have a space of their own where they can, some of the culturally relevant developmental materials, or if they want to create an atmosphere in a space where children can be welcome and not necessarily restricted by some of the things that, or some of the requirements that are in a center-based program. That's some of the things that I've seen and some of the conversations that I've had. But I really think it's just that overall commitment to community that helps to keep individuals in the space. And in that continuum of, I think, of like education and development. And what I've seen and what I've experienced as well is there's a special place that the FFN providers have in a community, right? It's a level of love, but also it's like everyone knows this individual, right? And knows what they've done and the commitment that they've had to that community, to that space. And I think even looking back in history, right, like that has always been a part of our communities. And I think even having or working in a space and having a position such as that, I think it's a brings of great value and a sense of admiration as well. So I think that definitely contributes to it.
Absolutely. And Dr. Govan-Hunt, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I just wanted to mention that the licensing process is cumbersome. So, there have been some folks who recognize that even our licensed family child care home providers are not being supported the way that they need to be supported, that they should be supported financially, with resources, with training, with access to higher levels of education. And so they just say, you know what? What am I giving up to go through this process? What type of peace of mind am I giving up in order to become a licensed, program? I'd rather just do it this way because our children are being served well. I'm being taken care of. I'm being this resource in my community. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that.
I want to say, Dr. Johnson, that's a great point. Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad that Dr. Govan-Hunt mentioned that, because that is exactly what happens here as well. And in my time working at Crystal Stairs, which is the largest resource and referral agency here in Los Angeles County, that was what we heard often, because it is very, it can be very difficult to get licensed here. And some folks say exactly what she said. You know what? I'm good with staying in this space. I'm serving my community. I don't have to deal with all these people coming in and out and monitoring me and checking boxes and so forth. And so they're fine with staying in that space. So yeah, that absolutely is something that happens here as well.
Yeah, no, and I think what you're also pointing to and raising actually ties to, sort of the challenge of licensure, which again, really thinking about, historically, and part of the reason why we really want to celebrate the vital contributions of Black women in this conversation is because we have history that tells us about surveillance. History that tells us about surveillance as it relates to sort of perpetuated biases, systemic inequities that can also disadvantage providers as well. And so oftentimes licensure requirements as well as surveillance protocols can often favor sort of standardized and formalized settings and inadvertently neglect the unique circumstances and cultural practices that Black women FFN providers can bring to caregiving. And I think sort of threading that piece is very important for this conversation, because we know that when there are these barriers that can hinder providers' ability to fully engage sort of with this formalized system, right? But moreover, even when we think about surveillance, it's rooted in sort of stereotypes and biases that oftentimes lead to disproportionate scrutiny and even distrust. Now, I recognize that when we think about surveillance and even licensure, I know that, there are people that are large proponents of it because they think about high quality when they see licensure. And I think that is very important to hold that in mind, and also holding in mind that we cannot for one moment think that there are instances where even processes like that can be crucial to the contributions of early childhood development overall, because, providers having to keep up, with the paperwork while also sort of addressing child development with a multifaceted approach that is rooted in culture. So it's really critical for us to make sure that, when we have this conversation, that I'm, maintaining this really respectful approach to and honoring sort of the vehicle by which we can serve more children, that there's an accountability system when we talk about licensure, but also when we talk about the valuable care that Black family, friend and neighbor care women provide is as a result of their expertise, because they are not only bringing their expertise, but they're bringing their resilience to the work that they do. So we want to just acknowledge that they're overcoming a lot of the things that they're working through to still then be able to provide early childhood care. So really want to contribute to a narrative that really empowers them to thrive, to recognize not just among ourselves, but across this country about the deep understanding of the communities that they serve. And so when we say things like trust, when we say things like community, when we say things like relationship, we're talking about an early childhood experience brought about by practices informed by a love that's deeper than anything that we can describe. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Often would say, it's that, it's a recognition of our cosmic companionship through the work that we're doing. And so I just want to acknowledge that while Black women are navigating the challenges of funding, navigating the challenges of narratives, navigating the challenges of surveillance, navigating all of these different challenges, they're still delivering on the promise of a just, inclusive, and equitable early childhood contribution and development that values and uplifts the essential needs and responds to the needs of young children in their care. So I really appreciate you all naming that and really threading that, because we know that there is no argument from any of us that our children deserve high quality early childhood experiences that affirm and expand our children. And we at the same time want to be clear about the world that we're creating for them. And so as we're sort of somewhat in the midway point here in our conversation, and I want us to really start thinking about, pointing towards the future. And I know that part of our values of the National Black Child Development Institute, not just are inclusive of equity and inclusion, but also justice and Afrofuturism. And what we know about Afrofuturism is that it is a concept where we envision for Black children this informed collective effort of individuals and families, communities, advocates, institutions about the importance of centering the lived experiences of the families that we work with, so that, i.e. the voices of Black families vis-a-vis our village leaders, but also rethinking how we discuss promoting cultural representation in this kind of expression of care. So I want us to spend the remaining time that we have together talking about the future and talking about our baby's future, because we are now, as part of this conversation, really lending our voices to a narrative of the future. And so when we think about Afrofuturism, and if we would for one moment imagine that each of us has on our Afrofuturism lenses, shout out to my glasses crew, Dr. Govan-Hunt. I'm gonna just imagine you on some stellar glasses. So we'll just name that these are our Afrofuturist lenses. And when we have these on, I want us to take just a moment in this time that we have together, to imagine a world where our babies are experiencing, affirming, and expanding upon their potential in spaces and places that are led by FFN providers whom are often Black women. And so when we think about, the future, and when we think about how we want to uplift Black women, but also the children that they care for, what do you hope to see as it relates to family, friend, and neighbor care in your state? And, I know that that is, when I think about, sort of the broadness of that question, but really zeroing in on many of the things that you threaded together and named about security, about community, about love. But in a perfect world, which I'll say in a just world is really what we're aiming towards, what is your hope for Black women, family, friend, and neighbor care providers to know, to feel, and for their children to experience? And so, Kamren, I can start with you.
First, I greatly appreciate the question. I think two things, right? There's a plethora, but I'll just state two. Pay equity, I think, is necessary. And when I say pay equity, I don't just mean the salary that individuals, that FFN providers will be receiving, but also benefits, right? So not only because we understand the work that they're doing is helping to lead a generation forward, helping to uplift communities, it's important that they have the opportunity to do that while also knowing that they don't have to worry about providing for their family as well, right? I think that's critically important, and it's necessary. But two, and it brings me to my second point. Everyone else, specifically on a local, state, and federal level, acknowledges and knows it as well. The value that they bring to the table. I was looking at an article recently. So in DC, the council passed the Pay Equity Fund that allows for early childhood providers and FFN providers as well to receive additional funding to be on par with DC public schools. Recently, the mayor proposed about a $5.2 million cut in the pay equity budget. And Cynthia Davis, who is the executive director of DC Family Child Care, one of the things she mentioned, and she was discussing why this is an issue and the message that it sends. But then her last comment was, I'm looking forward to a time where we don't have to debate the importance of these funds. And then she asked the question, which I thought was just extremely powerful. It was, haven't we given enough? And I'm looking forward to a time where we realize all that Black women have given, and specifically Black women FFN providers. So.
Absolutely, and I would echo, what has certainly been provided throughout history and to present day is more than enough for pay equity, and so definitely want to direct the question as well to you, Dr. Govan-Hunt. When you think about the future, what do you want Black FFN, Black women, family, friend, and neighbor care providers to know, to feel, and for their children to experience?
In an Afrofuturist society, our Black women, our Black family, friends, and neighbor care providers would not have to apologize for being who they are, for delivering care and resources the way that they do in their communities. They would there would be equitable pay, there would be equitable supports for them to continue to deliver the care that they do. These conversations around family, friends, and neighbor care and our women would not be fault-finding conversations, but they would lean into what NBCDI believes, which is to be a strength-based lens. We would not have to go in with faults, and this is what's wrong, and this is what's not safe, but actually recognizing the brilliance that these women bring to the table every single day for little or nothing, but the satisfaction of knowing that they are helping to raise children, are part of a village, to send children off into society that are emotionally sound, that are socially sound, that are confident in themselves and their voice, that know how they exist as individuals and as a part of a larger community. In an Afrofuturist society, we would all, not just our Black community, but everybody who touches our children, who serves our children, who are in our communities, who sell products in our communities, act, in the words of NBCDI's Family Empowerment affirmation, act as if it is impossible to fail. In an Afrofuturist society, we all will act as if it is impossible to fail, not being afraid to say that, yes, this is the type of care that I want for my child because I am my child's first and most important educator and lifelong advocate. You're not going to tell me anything different. And that I trust my community. I know what my grandmothers and my sisters and my aunts have been doing for my community for decades. Nobody can tell me anything different than that, other than to pat me on the back, give me a high five, or say, sister, how can we support you? That's what an Afrofuturist society looks like in my mind for these folks.
Yes, no, and I can already see you have some agreement certainly in the chat, and I certainly agree and appreciate you sharing that, and certainly you have my vote. So Alethea says, and I couldn't agree more. And Michelle, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to that question as well. When we think about Afrofuturism, we think about Black women, family friend, and neighbor care providers. What do you hope for them to know, feel, and for their children to experience in your?
How much more is there to say? Hey, I'm gonna give her the snaps, right? Absolutely, she hit the nail on the head. That was definitely on point. Again, being unapologetically Black, right? Which is what NBCDI, Dr. Austin says, that is how I see and hope for us to move forward with everything that has to do with our children, their care. Why do we have to, and we don't have to. So let's keep pushing forward that we are unapologetically Black. We unapologetically support our children, our FFNs, our culture, everything that we do, the way that we do it. We have survived this long. I mean, it's amazing and incredible. And our children, in order for them to be able to thrive and survive in this world and everything that it's doing, everything that it's trying to do, continue to do to us now to keep us down. We have to continue these conversations. Often it starts with the care of our children in these FFN settings. We should always keep our children front of mind, and we have to continue the conversation. And the states have to recognize, they need a livable wage, and that parents can, this is what they choose to do. And you shouldn't be able to legislate and tell us, where we have to send our kids. Using the term surveil and surveillance, I said monitored, but when you flipped it to, it's the same, it's huge. And the disparities there and finding fault, as Dr. Govan-Hunt said, that's always kind of the case, going in to do gotcha, we're going to find something and some reason that, what you're doing is not okay. And we need to leave it as parent choice. The bottom line to me, and that's one thing I say about our state, some states not so much, we have parent choice here. Licensed, unlicensed family child care providers. While I worked for Child 360 LA Up, we did so much with family child care providers. And in my years at Crystal Stairs, I've seen some amazing licensed family child care homes. I mean, these mostly women too, doing a great job. And the more resources that we can give to them, and all providers, but our FFNs, especially, in the future, I see that, and that we continue to educate and advocate for Black women who do this work.
Yes, no, and I think that this has been such an incredible conversation. I see that Celine has acknowledged some feedback that we've seen, some sentiments from the audience. And actually related to your point, Shelley, about Crystal Stairs, my good friend Justin Blakely is here. It's good to see you, Justin. I'm glad that you're here. He has shared that Crystal Stairs has over 70% of FFN providers serving children and families currently in LA, and FFN providers are critical to our child care system. Recognizing the impact is most certainly a reason to stay committed, especially given the cultural disparities already heavily prevalent, and that children need consistently nurturing, uplifting, and affirming environments and providers who understand that they are invaluable, especially in regard to pay, and that parents should be empowered with knowledge of legislation to have the power of vote and being present at city council and state level voting, budget, and compliance meetings to offer our children equitable opportunities and experiences, and that absolutely the pandemic has provided a space for FFNs to be seen as heroes. A lot of centers in our region have not bounced back in their enrollment as families have chosen to stay with FFN care. And so just wanted to acknowledge those sentiments in this conversation, and just say that, that in this future that we see, that we envision, this world where Black women FFN providers are not only recognized, valued, and celebrated for their immeasurable contributions, but to add in what you all have shared, that they are provided with the resources and support that they need to thrive. And that we want Black women FFN providers to know that their expertise, their wisdom, the nurturing care hold immeasurable value in shaping the lives of children and families. And we want them to feel a profound sense of empowerment, knowing that their experiences and unique perspectives are not only respected, but sought after within the early childhood care landscape. But also, I would say, as you all mentioned, being free from the burden of unjust bias and systemic barriers, striving for a world where their licensure processes are culturally responsive, equitable, but celebrating and embracing the diverse caregiving practices that they bring. And we want their children to experience an environment where cultural heritage is honored, their identities are affirmed, and their individual needs are met with love and compassion. And same in this future where Black women FFN providers and their children will thrive in a society that recognizes and values their incredible impact on early childhood development. So, I couldn't agree more that we all aspire to foster a culture where their autonomy, as you shared, their expertise, or their cultural wisdom are upheld and supported by policies and systems that prioritize equity, inclusivity, and social justice. But ultimately, we want Black women FFN providers to know that their care is seen, felt, and transformative, and that their children are experiencing the nurturing embrace that affirms their identities, that ignites their curiosities, that fosters this deep love for learning. That has been evident in all of our journeys, but also together striving towards this future where the powerful contributions of Black women FFN providers are not only recognized, but play a central role in shaping a brighter tomorrow for our children and communities. So I just, again, want to thank all of you so much for your sharing of your time, of your expertise, of your love for Black children, of your joy for being cared for by Black women, of your leadership, and of your experiences. And again, just thank you so much for your expertise. But I also want to just acknowledge all of you again that have been joining us in the chat and have been even sharing, how can we, stay connected to this work. And I would be remiss not to acknowledge that we do have a conference that is coming up. And guess where it is being hosted? In no greater place than Charlotte, North Carolina. And so, as you know, Dr. Devonya Govan-Hunt, as the president of BCDI Charlotte, is who we are excited to be partnering with for this year's conference. So as you can see on the screen, I'm sharing these dates, making it known to everyone, October 13th through the 15th. Our National Black Child Development Institute Conference will take place in Charlotte. And we will make sure to provide the registration link in the chat for those of you, and it looks like Jenny has already shared that link to the conference, but also, I'm getting word that we are sold out on registration, but that there's a virtual option that is forthcoming. So I just want to name that. So while we are sold out for registration right now, there is a virtual option that is coming, which is, again, great news. This is a good problem to have. So again, I just want to thank so many of you for joining us today. As I said from the beginning, near and far, as I said from the beginning, from looking at the chat, many of you I've known for just a little while, but many of you I've known for many years. And again, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. Kamren Rollins, thank you so much for your leadership, brother. Thank you, Dr. Devonya Govan-Hunt, for your leadership and expertise, and Schellee Rocher, thank you so much for your leadership. And again, shout out to many of you working behind the scenes, Celine Corby and Jenny Patterson, also Nassim Redmond and Dominic Reed, who made sure that this would go off without a hitch. And so again, just want to thank you all. If there are no other thoughts, we certainly invite your feedback. Upon the ending of today's webinar, there will be a brief survey that we would ask for you to complete regarding today's session. And we look forward to your feedback, and thank you so much for standing in the commitment to this work on behalf of Black children and families. Thank you so much.